I'll take you through for a few more minutes, looking at some of the content which is within our new primer, the A-Track primer I've shared earlier, particularly focusing on why nature matters to business and finance. Next slide, please. A lot of you, as we've seen from the poll, will be probably already familiar with these concepts, but they really are a lot of foundational elements and principles which underpin a lot of the rationale and reasoning that Rosie will turn to later, particularly in the next presentation, on how nature connects to finance roles and core processes. But fundamentally, one of the important principles here is that all businesses depend on nature. And so nature in its broadest sense. Businesses depend on nature for water, for other raw materials, for services that nature provides, such as protection from flooding, soil erosion, and other hazards, for pollination, and of course for climate regulation. But as I started off with my initial framing, nature is unfortunately in a bit of a perilous state, because it's not appropriately priced by business and financial markets. Our current economic and business models are generally are harming nature at quite an unprecedented rate. And so the evidence shows us that the majority of the critical ecosystem services that businesses depend on are in decline, including nature's ability to store carbon, which is adding to climate change. So this is putting businesses, capital providers, and the wider financial system at increasing physical risk. So, for example, water stress and resource shocks are disrupting operations in many sectors, from agriculture to manufacturing. And land use change is worsening damage to infrastructure assets from flooding, fires, and extreme heat. And habitat and biodiversity loss are threatening key commodity supply chains, from consumer industries to agricultural pollinators. So the evidence on risk exposure is mounting, and it's compelling. Some example statistics are shown here, again drawn from the primer. I mean, for example, analysis highlights that some 60% of the value traded on the Euronext is highly exposed, which is above the global average of 51%. Okay, next slide, please. And at the same time, we've talked about physical risks. Pressure to address business impacts on nature creates transition risks as the world responds. You can see here on this slide a number of global, national, regional developments which are worthy of note and matter to finance teams of business. So the Global Biodiversity Framework, of course, many of you will be aware of, if not all, was signed by the world's governments in 2022, setting out a transformative agenda for reversing global nature loss by 2030. And policymakers and regulators are translating these commitments into regional, national policies, such as through the EU's Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive and the regulation on deforestation-free products, among others. And the landscape on reporting standards, of course, continues to evolve, as many of you will no doubt be aware, with disclosure of material information on nature-related matters required under international financial reporting standards, sustainability disclosure standards, for example. And businesses and financial institutions are increasingly committing to voluntary sustainability initiatives, such as the Finance for Biodiversity Pledge. And of course, the Task Force on Nature-related Financial Disclosures, reflecting a growing industry-wide concern over nature-related risks. And of course, important to mention that markets, consumer expectations are also shifting rapidly, with evidence pointing to a significant majority shifting financial or purchasing decisions towards more sustainable options in the last 5 years. So, as I mentioned, all of these factors create transition risk for business, whereby the impacts that businesses or business activities have on nature can trigger negative consequences for the business, such as losing customers or market share, legal costs, and increased compliance costs. Next slide, please. So these nature-related risks can translate into a range of financial effects for businesses. Recent research by the Task Force on Nature-related Financial Disclosures, which is the source of this figure here, working with other partners, involved a global synthesis of the evidence. And many of you will have seen this report, which showed that far from being distant risks, many of these financial effects are already being felt by businesses. And this graphic shows how physical risks and transition risks and increasingly risks at the ecosystem or financial system level, systemic risks, are transmitted to businesses through a number of channels, which are the orange boxes you can see here. This includes direct microeconomic effects, such as changes in the cost of utilities, labor, consumer demand, indirectly by macroeconomic factors, such as fluctuations in market prices, inflation, and trade flows, for example, and through market competition, insurance companies, and capital providers. So examples from around the world have shown that these effects can materialize in a range of ways, including direct financial losses, and changes to debt or equity valuations, access to finance, cost of capital, and insurance premiums. They might also affect capital expenditure, divestment, or asset retirements, for example, through business response strategies. So in summary, nature risk is increasingly financial risk, and failure to manage these risks effectively can have significant, sometimes material effects on financial performance, potentially undermining a company's ability to operate and its long-term viability as a going concern. Next slide, please. And of course, it's important to note that wherever there is risk, there's opportunity. And as nature-related risks that we've discussed here become more visible and society responds, new market opportunities are opening up for companies that proactively address these challenges. They're innovative products and services. You can see here in this table here, excuse the small text, you can find out again more information in the primer. But innovative products and services, resource-efficient solutions, nature-positive investments, and nature restoration projects can all reduce risks, creating competitive advantage and opening up fresh revenue streams. So the size of the prize is significant. Businesses across all sectors and geographies are taking steps increasingly to integrate nature into their business strategies alongside climate, taking this broader lens, strengthening stakeholder trust, unlocking new forms of finance, and driving long-term value. I'm going to pause here. That's a lot of information. Again, please dip into the primer to find out more, get in touch. All of this information, further explanations, case studies, and signposts to other resources are found inside. So please do take a look. I think one more slide from me before I hand over to Rosie. Next slide, please. I wanted to share a story, a short story, and a fictional story. This is one that we've used and developed throughout the primer to help bring the concepts that we've discussed to life, to help bring them to life. This story is about a fictional business called Verde Immo, which is a European property development and investment group in the story, which faced significant financial impacts when water scarcity, again, a growing issue across Europe and many other locations globally. It experienced water scarcity at a project site on the outskirts of Seville, one of its development pipeline projects, which led to construction delays. And in our story, construction was halted after authorities, seeing the escalating water scarcity issue, enforced water rationing, causing delays and increased costs. The financial consequences rippled, of course, from that trigger, including higher operating expenses, a deferral of rental income due to construction delays, leading to an asset impairment on the balance sheet, and increased borrowing and insurance costs, and reduced equity value. So in addition to the financial effects, reputational challenges also prompted calls for better project risk management and contingency planning. And while this story is fictional and hopefully helps to sort of bring these concepts to life, it does highlight the real challenges that businesses across the globe are facing. Nature-related risks can quickly impact a company's financial health and resilience. We'll find out what happens next in the story later in the session. But now, delighted to hand over to you, Rosie. You'll be exploring how finance teams can respond and lead the way in embedding